Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today I'll be showing you how I built this desert terrain base for my life-size BD-1 Droid nightlight. I bought a set of these cheap 2-inch chip brushes to use as my long grass tufts. I didn't quite know the best way to disassemble the brushes, so the first brush was definitely an experiment in efficient bristle removal. I ended up settling on what should have been my first choice: scissors. Everything I used for this project will be linked down in the description below. I drilled a bunch of different sized holes in a piece of plywood to use as my form for making my grass tufts. I thought that this would be the best way for me to get different sizes of tufts, but in the end, the small holes proved to be pretty difficult to work with, and I ended up switching to a piece of wood with much larger holes, as you'll see later in the video. The idea was to put a bunch of dabs of glue on a sheet of wax paper, and then slide these bristles down through the holes, let that dry, and then you have grass tufts. But the roughness of the holes in the wood prevented the bristles from sliding easily down into the glue. But once I switched to a 1/2-inch diameter hole, everything went together much easier. And here you can see those grass tufts. Once these larger tufts had dried, I was able to break them into smaller pieces if I needed smaller bits of grass. Off camera, I primed and sanded this 3D printed base I designed in Blender. It's a 15-inch diameter circle with 3mm walls. The base you see me working on here is actually my first version. It had 1mm thick walls, and those cracked fairly quickly. I cut out a small hole for the 12-volt connector and made sure that everything sat clean and mostly flush. This was my first time working with XPS foam, and so I didn't quite know what to expect. I just knew that I needed to get a bunch of layers glued together and cut to fit within the circle base. Here I am cutting each layer to approximately 15 inches and then slowly whittling down the layers to get everything to fit snugly. I probably should have cut everything to a bit of a smaller inner diameter since it gave me a bit of problems later on down the road, and I'll be sure to do that next time. I knew I wanted the base to be a bit asymmetrical and feel more natural, and so I decided on doing a tall rock formation in the back of the base with a smaller rock outcropping in the front. I also knew I needed to make room for BD's feet, and so here I'm drawing the approximate shape of everything and making sure that I have enough room for BD's legs. From there, I just started carving slowly to get everything to fit, slowly cutting each layer, making sure that the center has a nice flat spot for BD to rest. And once I had the general shape that I wanted, I glued the layers together using the base as a guideline to hold everything together. Some of the glue was still wet the next day when I checked on the base, so I wiped off the excess and let it dry a few more hours. From there, I scribed a line around the foam so that I knew the lowest point at which I should be cutting. I did a bunch more checking to make sure I had room for BD's feet, and then began the carving process. And once that was done, I marked and cut a hole for the wires that would run down from BD's leg and into the base. I also marked out a trench for the wire to run and began cutting using my soldering iron. I wore a respirator the entire time I was cutting, since it's a very bad idea for you to get these fumes in your lungs. Through most of this step, I didn't really know what I was doing. I just knew that the general rule of thumb is that you want some diagonal lines and some horizontal lines, and then you pick that apart until you've got some rocks forming. I think it may have helped me to have some reference photos to look at, since I definitely felt like I was flying blind for most of this. For the longest time, the base wasn't really looking like anything special, and I really didn't like the way that it looked. Looking back on this footage, I think my main problem was that my cuts were too dense, and I think that if I had done less cuts, I could have ultimately ended up with a bit of a more blocky texture, since most rocks don't have so many little bits sticking out of them. They're more smooth and worn from years of weathering. I think the base really began to take shape when I started to remove more material, making these deep gouges going diagonally in the rock face. Until that point, everything kind of just looked like a big bowl of popcorn or something, and there wasn't enough variation in surface level. Nature is definitely a more asymmetrical thing, and you don't ever really see a rock face with rocks sticking out at vaguely the same level. So I felt these deeper cuts added to the dimension of the base. Once I was happy with the way the foam looked, I hit it quickly with a heat gun on a very hot setting. The heat melts the foam, removing kind of the fringy fraying bits of the foam, and kind of adds a bit of a glazy, glossy, harder texture to the foam, which further sells the look of rock. For this step, I used some matte Mod Podge, some cheap acrylic paint, and plaster. I want to stress that it is totally fine to use cheap acrylic paint for the base coats and even the washing of your bases. These bottles are 50 cents a piece, which is great because I don't have to worry about using too much. And if I mix too much in a batch, I'm not breaking the bank when I throw it away. So for this first layer, I mixed it extra runny so that it was easily spreadable into all the nooks and crannies. You want to be sure that everything is sealed before you move on to the more watery, washy mixes. I ended up doing 2 separate layers of this beige mixture. On the second coat, I added sand. My thought process was that I wanted to differentiate the rocks from the more sandy, rocky desert floor texture. Rocks are rough, but they're not quite sandy, granular rough. And so spreading this sandy mixture on just the floor helped break up the overall look, and I think helped sell the desert terrain look a bit more. While that second, more sandy coat of sealer was still wet, I grabbed some more sand and pebbles that I found in my backyard and kind of haphazardly sprinkled them around the base of the rocks. You'll also see in the corner there a piece of bark that I used to kind of cover up a gap in the rocks that I didn't totally like the look of. Bark is a really good way to get a rocky look without the weight of actual rocks. Once I was happy with my extra sand and pebble placement, I let the second sandy layer dry and then went back with some IPA and watered down white glue to further seal all of that texture into the base. I probably could have done this while that second coat of sealer was still wet, but like I said, this is my first time doing this and I just wanted to be sure nothing got too runny. Set it in my paint booth with my space heater and let it dry for most of the day. Looking back, this next step was a bit redundant, but I went over everything with a single coat of watered down beige. I think my idea was that before I started washing the base, I wanted everything to be one consistent color, but you could probably skip this step, since ultimately the variation in the sand colors I think would further sell the look of real desert terrain. Once that final base coat had dried, I began on what I thought was going to be my first layer of washes. But as I began washing with this darker brown color, I started to notice that the two colors didn't quite work well together, and that I favored this darker brown. So even though I started off treating this brown like a wash, ultimately I decided that the entire base should be this color, which even further solidifies my previous statement that the lighter base coat was completely unnecessary. Once the brown wash was completely dry, I went back over all the recesses of the base with a blackish brown mixture. This is to help emphasize the shadows in the rock formations, and I also used it on the lower points of the desert floor. Once all my washes were dry, I went back through with a beige dry brush, but I quickly realized that the color was too white for my liking, and so I mixed some brown into it to get it a little closer to the rock color that was already there. The goal of dry brushing is to highlight all of the edges of your base, and you accomplish that by doing 2 to 3 passes of different colors, working from a darker light shade to a lighter light shade, letting each coat dry before the next. With each pass, you want to be sure that you're getting lighter and lighter with your touch as well, so that you're left with this very natural gradient on all the edges of the rocks. It's pretty easy to overdo this step, so just work slowly. Worst case scenario, you just go back with a dark wash again and start all over. While I was waiting for that final dry brush to dry, I went ahead and painted the ring of the base with a satin black enamel. I explained in my last video how I anchored BD to the base, but for anyone who hasn't seen it, it was simply some metal rods glued into holes I drilled in his feet and then stuck and glued into the foam of the base. Here I'm cutting a little extra space for the wires so that they lay flat underneath the foam. Alright, now that all the washing of the base is done, it's time to add the little details. I still was not entirely sure if these little bristles would look good on the base, but I figured they would be better than nothing. And because all the bristles were basically the same length, I decided to do a little bit of barbering with my flush cutters. I worked from the outside in, cutting at a slight angle, with the outside tufts being shorter and the inside tufts being longer. I also made sure to never cut a bristle the same length as the one next to it. This sort of randomness will further sell the look of real plants, since nothing is perfectly symmetrical in nature. I didn't get any footage of me dry fitting the tufts, but once I was happy with their placement, I went back with a little bit of watered down white glue and a pinch of sand here or there to cover up the transition between rock and grass. And while the tufts were drying, I hit the base ring with 1500 grit sandpaper just to clean up any little imperfections there might be, and then I clear coated it with a satin enamel. I was feeling pretty good about how everything was looking, but I didn't like that there were some obvious gaps between BD's toes and the base. So my solution to that was to just add a little bit more watered down glue and sprinkle some sand over those gaps. I tried to be as natural in my application as possible, and I kind of feathered out the application of the sand to the rest of the base to sort of tie everything together. I didn't want it to be super obvious that the dark sand was an afterthought, and so I sprinkled more of it randomly around the base to tie everything together. And once the glue was dry, I went back dusting the excess off with a blower and a brush. Next time, I'll probably use a vacuum. Here's me doing a few more touch-ups just to further tie the darker sand into the rest of the base. Once the clear coat on the base ring had dried, I installed some little rubber feet and began the process of putting it all together. I fished the little 12-volt connector into the hole, and then using the male side of the connector, held it in place while I glued it down. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I should have made that foam just a hair smaller than I did, and I also should have been more careful to not get sand and glue on the very bottom of the base. And as you'll see here, I had to go around cutting little bits of rock and foam off to get the whole thing to fit together. And because some of those rocks scratched the nice clean surface of the black base ring, I went back with a brush and black paint to do some touch-ups. And once that was done, there was nothing to do but break out the black backdrop for some glamour shots. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. Like I've said before, I'm still very new to this whole world of prop making, terrain building, and weathering. If you've got any suggestions that would improve the quality of my builds, or any tips or tricks that might make my life easier, drop them in the comments below. And if you're interested in seeing more from me, make sure to subscribe. I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. Thanks again for watching. Have a good day.